What did a 20th century Jewish rabbi have to do with the crucifixion of Jesus? Abraham Heschel was a 20th century Jewish rabbi. He was born in Poland in 1907, and at the age of 9, his father died of influenza. The influenza that killed more people across Europe and American GIs that returned home than died in the war itself. The war supposedly to end all wars. When the Nazis rose to power in Germany, his mother and his 3 sisters were taken to concentration camps where their lives were destroyed. He escaped to the United States. He became a university professor and eventually a rabbi. And even in the Second Vatican Council, he was asked to serve as a consultant to Jewish and Christian relationships and helped indirectly and directly to articulate the Vatican II document on the relationships between Christians and Jews. He was influenced as a Jew, as was Jesus as a Jew, by the writings of the prophets. And he considered the writings of the prophets to be what he called a clarion call, a distinct call to lay down our lives for others. It led him to preach and act in the U.S. in the civil rights movement. And he even marched in Selma, Alabama in 1965. When I first learned of him, I remember asking, how did he transform this experience? I remember asking to myself, I think about the petty things that get me down, and I think, how did this guy do this? How did this man do this? How did he transform his experience as the only surviving member of his family and risk his role as a rabbi and risk his life to serve in the civil rights movement? And I read an interview with him where he was asked that question, and his answer was one sentence: words create worlds. Words create worlds. The words that the Nazis spoke about the Jews created a world where it was acceptable to do things of indescribable proportions. The words that people spoke about African Americans created a world where daily discrimination and even something as gross as lynching a human being became acceptable. Words create worlds. They're not just grim. Think about words like, will you marry me? When I asked Mary Ann, will you marry me? I was the king of romance. I think of all these young folks who go get pictures taken and surprise each other when we propose. I proposed over a pizza after a Blues hockey game. I told one of my buddies later, I thought I sounded like I had an out-of-body experience, like, what am I saying here? I've been wanting to say it for a while, and I finally blurted it out. And I actually think I sounded like Sylvester Stallone, like, hey, you want to marry me, Mary Ann? Hey. When the doctor said each time, it's a boy, created an incredible world. When our son Andy went to Providence, Rhode Island, a word that means divine favor, and he did a service project and came back a deeper and more loving person, the words of that town created a world. It wasn't lost on me that he served in an inner city school in Providence, Rhode Island. Maybe somewhere here at the CSC, someone said to you, have you ever thought about going on a service trip? And those words created a world. Or have you ever thought of coming to this place called the CSC? You really should come here. They have this really low-key, bashful pastor at this place. You should come here. Maybe we can help him overcome his shyness problem sometime. Jesus' words created worlds that drew people to him and drew people to take immense risk to seek healing. But he also, the words he spoke, created a world that led to his crucifixion. There is no doubt of that. And the crucifixion is not a one-time event. It goes on all the time. It occurs in Aleppo, Syria, where 4 hospitals were bombed that were occupied by people already injured in their uprising. It occurs in deaths by violence in our country, where for myself, I frequently think, what is our threshold for death by violence? We do this in movie theaters. We do this in nightclubs. We do this in schools, for God's sake. What is our threshold for violence? And when I've heard people say, why does God allow this? I frequently ask them back, why do we allow this? When we pursue material goods to the detriment of our earth, we participate in the crucifixion. When we verbally demolish each other, online, face-to-face, when we hide behind our domain names and tear people to shreds, we participate in the crucifixion. And when we engage in self-criticism, we do as well. There's a wonderful book that caught me off guard when I read it. It's called The Untethered Soul, and it's a book about meditation and prayer. But Michael Singer, the author, really got my attention in the book when he talked about how much we struggle with our inner roommates. That we have inner roommates that say things to us that we would never let a roommate say to us. We would move out. He gave these great examples of saying something if you said to a roommate, I think I'm going to start a walking program to help me keep my weight in check and improve my metabolism. And if your roommate said, you're going to do a walking program? I've seen you walk to the door to let the Domino's guy in, but you're going to walk? Or I'm going to go back to school? You're going to go back to school? You didn't do so great in school the first time. And he said we frequently say those things to ourselves. And I submit that when we do that, we participate in the crucifixion. There are many deaths that occur in our family structures that it's difficult to overcome divorce. When we have a break in friendship or a break in a love relationship. When we're not selected for a scholarship or we're not selected for the graduate program in which we wish to participate. Those things happen for a period of time. We can feel more dead than alive. So where's God in all of this? And how do we become transformed from the crucifixion and the tomb to the resurrection? I've been volunteering here some, and in these groups with young folks, I have great admiration for you, for the things some of you have done, coming from foreign countries to study here, coming here and opening your hearts to people and opening yourselves to what you can learn, the studies you're taking on. It's incredible. But if I could do anything and open up your heads, and as an old guy, I always want to do that to people. I want to say, why don't you just bypass like 30 years and listen to me? I've got it all figured out. But one thing I want to say sometimes to people is that transformation, and we are all transforming, but in its early stages it feels like death. When we first bounce back from a love lost, it feels like death. When we are homesick at this school, it feels like death. When we are first being transformed. I worked with a physician, I worked for SSM Healthcare, and I did clinic administration for a time, and then mission integration. And I remember riding around rural Wisconsin with a physician there and looking at some of our medical operations in a community of people of the Hmong tradition, the Cambodian tradition who came here as refugees 40 years ago. Came as refugees to this country 40 years ago. And of all places, settled in Minnesota and Wisconsin, Cambodia and Vietnam, to the winters of Wisconsin and Minnesota. And he was talking about the farming communities there, and just riding through this rural area and having him say, this ground looks dead about 7 months of the year. This ground looks like it's dead. There's all kinds of stuff going on, getting ready for the next round of growth. This ground looks dead. There's all kinds of stuff going on under the surface. And dying, transformation does feel like dying when you first undertake it. A couple of examples for me of how words created worlds. When I was in college, and Gary spilled the beans and talked about how long ago we were in college, some of you here weren't even thought about by your parents back then. I had a small resurrection when I confided to a college professor who said to me one day, "You're on sometimes and other times you look checked out. You seem like a really bright, attentive guy, and other times you seem kind of lost to me." And I confided to him that I was concerned about being away from my family because of the alcohol abuse in my family. And after he listened for a while, he said, "You need to talk to somebody about this. I'm not really trained to do it. I care about you, but I'm not really trained to do this. And I think you should go to something called Al-Anon." And those words created worlds. The first time I walked in the therapist's office, I cried for over 20 minutes. And I was recognized even then the gift of tears. That it's a huge gift that enables us to cry out what's in us, whether it's sorrowful or joyful. And I'm a good crier now. Taught me the importance of that. But also, being in those groups, the words spoken, the words that were created from the worlds created from those words, were things like I had learned to be excessively self-critical. And I had said to myself stuff like, if I were a better son, my family would be better. And I lived with a lot of shame. The words spoken in those sessions and those conversations helped me integrate and ascend through the crucifixion. And I'm not trying to be overly dramatic, but it helped me to integrate what felt at times like a crucifixion and to integrate it and not shed it entirely. I can still slip back into this stuff. But it got me to understand the importance of the tomb of vulnerability, of introspection, of risk, of courage, courage building, and prayer. And if anything, I learned that most of my prayer, even to this day, is asking God to simply be with me. Help me to know that you are in me and with me, and I am worthy of you. A second quick story really struck me. I visited with someone recently, yesterday, spoke to someone who's a parent of a Down syndrome child. And this person, we had shared a story through my friend Sister Kathy. We had shared a story that's called Welcome to Holland. And this person is herself a parent. She wrote this during Down Syndrome Awareness Month. She herself is a parent of a Down syndrome child. And she likened learning that she had a Down syndrome child. She used this metaphor of going on a trip to Italy, where you say, I can't wait to go to Italy, to see these buildings, and to see this beautiful country, and to see this coastline, and to see Cinque Terre, and to see Venice, and to eat this marvelous food. And she said you get all excited about it, and you're getting ready to get off the plane, and over the intercom comes a message that says, "Welcome to Holland." She said your first thought is, wait a minute, how in the world did I get here? But in fact, she said the birth of our child was as a word saying to us, welcome to Holland. You're coming to somewhere else equally beautiful. That if you got off a plane in Holland and got around Holland, you'd see these beautiful canals and these tulips and the Zuider Zee and these areas and windmills and areas that are incredibly beautiful. They just happen to be beautiful in a way that differs from what you had thought. And those words created a world where she was able to help other people who were trying to integrate birth in ways they didn't anticipate. So, inherent, I think, in getting from the resurrection through the tomb, from crucifixion to resurrection to the tomb is being vulnerable. Is being able to say stuff like, I'm lost. We got lost in Ireland one time, and I remember asking a person for directions, and she said, oh, you just go down the road there. There's a couple trees. There's maybe 2 roads go that way, and there's a couple trees, and you go either left or right, and then you're on the road to where you're going. Being vulnerable enough to say I'm lost. Being vulnerable enough to walk in a therapist's office to people like Mary and Tom and Phil and say I am lost was groundbreaking. It's interesting to me, too, that the word for intimacy in Latin means into your fear. Intimacy means to enter into your fear. What does that mean? In friendship intimacy, in sexual intimacy, relational intimacy, it's entering into our fear and trusting that we'll be accepted. Home stretch. Helen Keller, and I learned this from my buddy Tom, he told me this story. Helen Keller was an American author and a political activist and I would say a humanitarian. In 1882, when she was 2 years old, she was stricken by an illness that left her unable to see or hear. And nonetheless, she graduated from college, went on to become an incredible model for other people. And her volatile relationship, and I would say it was volatile, with the person charged with helping her to adapt to her sensory losses, became the subject of the play entitled The Miracle Worker. Later in life, Helen Keller wrote this: the world is full of suffering, and the world is full of overcoming suffering. The world is full of suffering, and it's full of overcoming suffering. Thank you, Tom, for that story. Words create worlds. Father Richard Rohr, a Franciscan priest and a spiritual writer, says the following in several of his books: what we don't transform, we transmit. What we don't transform, we transmit, we pass on. If we don't transform hatred, we transmit it. If we don't transform our disdain for people who are different from us, we transmit it. If we don't transform unrelenting greed, we transmit it. Whatever we do not transform, we transmit, and we stay stuck then in the crucifixion, and we stay stuck in the tomb. And we are afraid then to roll back the stone and say, I am meant for better than this. I am a child of the resurrection. And so, in Syria, in Aleppo, 47 minutes after a hospital was bombed and damaged, a new hospital was being formed 2 city blocks away in an empty storefront. Resurrection. A 6th grader in the Northeast United States developed an application for kids